Hello, my name is Colin, and in this episode of Let's Learn Blender, we'll be looking at lights, shadows, and rendering in Blender's EEVEE render engine. Even if you're new to 3D modeling, 3D animation, and Blender in particular, you might know that if you go up to the render menu at the top of Blender's interface and click on render image, or you can press the F12 or function 12 key on your keyboard, you will get a pop-up window in Blender that starts rendering out a picture of your 3D scene from the perspective of your camera, complete with lighting and shadows and any rendering effects like ambient occlusion, subsurface scattering, particle and hair effects. All those things get drawn from the perspective of your camera to a final image that you can save to your computer. It's the job of a render engine, which is part of a 3D program like Blender, to do all this very intensive processing of calculating all the light and textures and shadows and shading in a 3D scene. In Blender, you can find which render engine that you're currently using by going over to the Properties editor, clicking on the little Camera tab, which looks like a little back of a DSLR camera, and selecting a render engine right here. The default render engine in the version of Blender that I'm using is EEVEE. Now, there are three you can choose from by default that come with Blender. There's EEVEE, the Workbench engine, and Cycles. EEVEE is Blender's default right now. I can't promise that it'll be the default render engine in all future versions of Blender, but it only came out in 2019, and it's, well, a modern and fast render engine that creates quite good results with an emphasis on speed. If you want to render out a whole animation that you've created and not have to wait hours and hours and hours, EEVEE is your choice. It works a lot like a high-powered modern game engine that kind of takes shortcuts to make a render happen really quickly, almost in real time. It can get very good-looking, cartoon-looking graphics very quickly, but don't expect absolute photorealism. You can get pretty close though. The Workbench render engine is more meant for technical drawings, diagrams, illustrations that you might find in a technical manual, or for architectural visualizations. You're not going to find any photorealism while using the Workbench render engine, but let's say you're making your own IKEA product catalog and you want to have a diagram of all the pieces that fit together to make a bookshelf. Well, the Workbench engine might be for you. The Cycles render engine is Blender's top-notch, photorealistic, professional production quality render engine. It's what's called a path tracing render engine, which means it actually calculates much more realistically than any of the other two render engines. Basically, paths of light calculated to illuminate surfaces, calculate reflections and shadows. It's what's used to make, well, professional looking cartoons and visuals. The trade-off is that it can take quite a long time to render even just one frame of an animation. But for this video, we'll be sticking with EEVEE. It's the default, and it's a very, very good modern render engine. Now, in Blender, as you probably know, by default, when you load up a new scene in Blender, you are presented with your 3D viewport in what's called solid view or solid viewport shading. If you click this fourth little button here, it switches you over into rendered viewport shading. And yes, this means that Blender is calculating the shadows and lighting as lighting is coming off of the default point light in your scene, cast on all the objects in your scene, by default just the cube. But let's go ahead and dive in a little bit more into the types of lights that you can use in a 3D scene, especially using the EEVEE render engine. I'm going to go ahead and add a simple floor into my scene. I'm going to press Shift A on my keyboard and add a mesh plane. I'll go ahead and tap S on my keyboard to make it bigger, to scale it up, and I'll tap 8 on my keyboard to scale it up 8 times and press Enter. I'm going to grab my default cube and press G on my keyboard to grab it. I'll tap Z on my keyboard to move it only up and down, and I'll tap 1 to move it up 1 on the Z axis and press Enter on my keyboard. Now you can see with a point light in my scene, I have a shadow being cast from the cube on the floor, and it's important to notice when you're getting into lighting the quality of the shadow. Right now, my shadow looks very, very flat. I can't really tell where my cube ends and the floor starts, and I have very harsh or hard shadows. That means the shadows have very hard edges that are very defined, and that might not be very flattering in a scene, especially with a character. Now, with a light object selected, you can go over to the Properties editor and go to the tab that looks like a little green light bulb. This is called the Object Data tab, and when you have a mesh object selected, that little tab looks like a triangle. It's always green, but if I select my light, and go to that tab, you can see the properties of that light object. Of course, you can change the power of a light, and in Blender, most commonly, lights are measured in watts, and the default power of the default light is 1000 watts, and that's a pretty good value to stick with. If I go up to the light and press X on my keyboard with it selected and delete that light and go up to the add menu and go to light, this is how you add new lights to your scene, and go to point, well, I'll go ahead and use my move tool. My light's actually at the origin of my 3D world. I'll go ahead and move it up and over. You can see that this light has a lot less power because by default, lights only have 10 watts of power. Again, 1000 is more along the lines of what you'd want, sometimes down to maybe a couple of 100 watts, sometimes up to many, many thousands of watts. That's really up to your needs in your scene. You can, of course, change the color of the light. If you click on this little white box, it'll bring up a color picker. You can choose a color. Let's say you're looking for a night scene, and so you want a blue tint of light on your scene. Well, don't go too crazy here because a little bit of color goes a long way. You can see this blue is way too blue on my scene, so I'll go ahead and turn it down all the way back near the middle. Just a little bit of blue is more than enough. Now, a point light, by the way, is one of 4 types of light objects that we'll be adding and looking at in this video. There are point lights, sunlights, spotlights, and area lights. And a point light is really just a speck or a sphere or an orb emitting light, kind of like a light bulb or one of those paper round lanterns that emits light in all directions. The light right now has a very small size. Its radius is right here. A small light in the real world will cast very harsh shadows like this light is right now, like a small light bulb. If I make the radius of the light bigger, you can see it transforming on the screen, will make soft shadows. And so you can see with a larger light, my shadows, as soon as I stop orbiting or panning around in my scene, or as soon as I stop grabbing and moving my light around, you will see that in the 3D viewport, the shadow becomes blurred. Now, don't worry too much about this kind of fragmentation look of the shadow. We'll fix that in just a little while in this video. That comes down to the number of samples that EEVEE is rendering out this scene with. The samples of our render engine EEVEE is right here under the camera tab, right here. We'll be looking at that a little bit later. It must be said that just like in the real world, when you have a light that's closer to a subject, that subject is lit with a higher intensity of light. That means it gets brighter. When you move a point light farther away from that object, well, not as much light is getting to that object, and so it's not lit as brightly. This effect is called light fall off, and that means that light loses power or loses intensity the farther it is away from the light source. And that is not always the case with all kinds of light in Blender. We'll be looking at the sunlight last out of these 4. And by the way, the sunlight never loses power over distance because the sun lights the entire world. Let's go ahead and delete this point light. I'll press X or delete on my keyboard and click on delete. I'll go up to the add menu. I'll add a light. The next kind of light I'll talk about is the area light. The area light is the most common kind of light that I use, and it's probably the most popular kind of light with professional 3D artists, as far as I can tell by looking online and seeing what everyone else on YouTube uses. Area lights are essentially a flat area of light, or a flat area that emits light onto a scene, but only in one direction. This makes area lights most closely resemble movie studio lights, where you'd have a big light setup. Usually I'll go ahead and tap R on my keyboard and rotate it so it's pointing at my scene. Usually a big flat diffuse area projecting light onto a scene, or using a reflection board that would reflect light coming from an opposite direction. Now you can see that this big area light has a shape and a size, and when I hover my mouse over the area light, you can see I get an on-screen gizmo in the form of a square that shows me the size and shape of the light, and if I just drag a corner of this square, it makes the area light bigger and smaller. And of course, light is being emitted from that entire surface on the side of the line. There is another gizmo on screen, it's this yellow dot, and if you grab it, you can kind of point the light in whatever direction that you want. It's a little bit tricky, but you might like it and you might get used to it. Of course, this light right now is not emitting very much light. If I go over to its properties, the object at a tab, of course, and I change its power value up to something more realistic, maybe 1500 watts, well, I get more light in my scene, and you can see that because I have a fairly large surface emitting light, my shadows are soft when I stop orbiting or moving anything in my scene. You can see the shadows are kind of soft. If I make the area light quite small, you can see my shadows are much more hard or distinct. So I'll go ahead and make this area light a little bit bigger. If you can't quite control it on screen, you can of course go down to the size property and just change it, or click and type a value in and press enter of your choice. Now the area light is not just a square, that's not your only option. Of course, you can change the shape to a rectangle, which means that you don't have to have two even sides. So here you can see I've got a rectangle, and you can make that whatever shape and size that you want. There is a disc, which is a circle, and it's basically controlled by, again, a square on screen. You can make the circle bigger or smaller, or an ellipse, which is basically an oval that you can make whatever size and aspect ratio that you want. I should also mention that you can also turn off shadows for a light. Now this sounds weird because when you have a light source in the real world, you will have shadows. But in 3D, you can control more than you can in the real world. You can have a light that doesn't emit shadows. If you want that, let's say you had multiple lights in a scene and all the lights were fairly small. I'll go ahead and turn this light down to a smaller size. Well, if you have multiple lights in your scene coming from different directions, you would have shadows being cast in many directions, which would not look very appealing. So you might actually take some of your lights, except for your primary or key light, and turn off the shadows. Now, would I recommend this in all circumstances, or really any circumstance? Not really. There are better ways of dealing with this, but just know you can have shadows or not if you don't want to. The next kind of light, I'll go ahead and press X with that light selected and delete it. I'll go up to the add menu and add a light spotlight. A spotlight does exactly what it sounds, or is exactly how it's described. It's a light that's confined to a cone. So you can see I've got this little yellow dot here on the screen that I can use to point this spotlight. I can control the cone of light with this little aqua colored arrow that I can pull and push towards or away from the light. I'll go ahead and select that light and turn its power up to, oh, let's say maybe 1500 watts and press enter. Maybe a little bit higher than that, actually maybe 2500 watts, and press enter. You can see what it does. It's confined to a cone. You can show the cone by clicking on show cone. This looks or makes in your 3D viewport kind of like some fog in the cone, which will not show up when you render. You're not going to get particles of dust or anything like that, or fog. It's just so you can see where it is more clearly. You can change the size, in other words, the angle of the cone from the top, from where the light is being emitted from. You can make it a smaller angle or a wider angle. You can change the blend, which is how blurry the edge of the light is. So if I turn the blend up, you can see it becomes more blurred. You can also, with a spotlight, change the radius, the size of the actual light source. This is not so much like in the real world, where you'd have a spotlight maybe at the back of an auditorium or a theater that would be casting a light on somebody on stage quite far away. Whenever you have that in the real world, because the light source is quite small compared to the distance of the light traveling and the subject that's being lit, well, you're going to get very harsh shadows normally on a spotlight. But if you don't want that, you can make the spotlight bigger, and it's just, well, it has a softer shadow if that's what you want. The last kind of light is a sunlight. I'll go ahead and press X on my keyboard and delete that spotlight. I'll go up to the add menu and add a light sun. By the way, if you add a light into your scene and then you change its type, let's say you added a point light or an area light and then you changed it to a sunlight, well, the brightness might be quite out of whack. If you have an area light, chances are you have a power of something like 1000 watts. Well, that measurement is great for an area light or maybe a spotlight or point light, but the power of a sunlight is measured differently. So if you switch over to sun, your sun's going to be way too bright. That's because a sun's fall off is not like a point, spot, or area light at all. Sunlights don't ever lose power over distance. So first of all, I should change the strength of the sunlight down to something like 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. I'm going to use maybe 2, and I'll press enter. You can see that's a more realistic value. Maybe it's a little bit dull, so maybe I'll say 3 or 4, maybe 5. That's probably bright enough. But if I move my sun, I'll go ahead and tap R to rotate it first of all. You can see a sunlight has a line coming off of it. You can control it with that same little yellow dot. But The neat thing here is if I move the light really far away or even below or on the opposite direction of my subject, nothing changes. That's because suns can be anywhere in your scene and they evenly light your entire scene, your entire world with just one sunlight, like global illumination, sort of. Let's go ahead and grab the sun and put it up here just to make it more realistic. You can change how soft the sun is, in other words, how soft the shadows are cast from your subjects by changing the angle. I'm not sure why it's called an angle, but if you make this angle bigger, you are essentially making the size of the sun perceptually from the scene as it casts light bigger, and so it casts a softer shadow, kind of like a cloudy day where you wouldn't have very harsh shadows. If you want a very sunny day that would cast very harsh shadows, well, you can have a very small angle, of course. So those are the 4 kinds of lights: point, area, spot, and sun. What I'm going to do now is talk about render settings, and to do that, I'm going to get rid of my sunlight. I'll tap X, delete, and go up to add, and I'll add a light, an area light, and I'll grab it, and I'll zoom in, and I'll make it bigger, and I will rotate it to face my subject. Maybe I'll move it over a little bit. Maybe I'll turn its power up to 1500 just so we have a nice little scene with some lighting. If you want your shadows to look a little bit bigger, or maybe you want your lighting to be more flattering or more realistic on your scene, you're going to want to go to the render settings tab, the back of the camera tab right there, and change some of these settings. First off is the sampling section here, which changes how many times basically iterations of shadows are calculated to give you smooth shadows. You can see that my shadows are quite fragmented when I stop orbiting or moving anything in my scene. The shadows should be soft, but they're not. Well, if I change these viewport and render sampling numbers up, you can see viewport, I'll change it up to, let's say 500 and press enter. You can see that Blender will go ahead, or EEVEE will go ahead in Blender's viewport and continually smooth out these shadows 500 times. Of course, if I orbit, you can see it's re-smoothing out again. That's what EEVEE does. Most commonly though, you would probably leave your viewport samples quite low, something like 32 or 64, and you would change your render settings up very high, usually something like 500 or 1000 or at least a few hundred, so you get smoother shadows. I'll go ahead and type 500 and press enter. So now in my viewport, I still have this fragmentation. If I go up to render and render image or press F12, and I wait a few moments, and yes, of course, when you have more samples, that will slow down your render times. You can see my shadows are fairly smooth. Am I happy with those? I might turn my samples up even high for my rendering, maybe up to 1000. That's up to you. Speaking of shadows, there is another section called shadows a little bit lower down under this camera tab in the properties window with a value for cube size and cascade size. These two values determine the resolution of the shadows, which will make the shadows look a little bit more crisp. You can see the edges of these shadows look quite jaggy, quite pixelated, and that's because shadows do have a finite resolution of number of pixels that they're calculated with. So if I turn the cube size up from 512 up to something higher, and of course, having a higher value here will mean that your render will take longer. Your viewport might not be as responsive. Mostly you'll be waiting longer for your renders. That's something that you'll have to see if is worth it for you. If I turn this value up to 2048 pixels and let it recalculate, you can see my shadows are much, much smoother. And when I go to render, of course, I'll have many, many more samples. So my shadows will be quite a lot smoother than before. This cube size value versus the cascade size value is for different types of lights. If I hover my mouse over this little 2048 pixel cube size value, you can see that the description says it's the size or resolution of shadow maps for point lights and area lights. So it does not affect the quality of shadows cast by a sun. If I go ahead and change this light into I'll go to my object edit tab right there, into a sunlight and change its strength down to maybe 6 or so and press enter, you can see the quality of these shadows isn't that great because I'll go back to my render settings and change the cascade size here. The cascade size is only for sunlights to a higher value, something like 2048 or even 4096. Yeah, the quality got better. You can also turn up high bit depth. That should increase the quality. And if you have a larger light source that is creating soft shadows, I'll go ahead and change my sun angle here to a larger appearing sun, so I get soft shadows. If you don't want ever soft shadows in your scene, you can turn that off and you'll always get quite harsh, distinct shadows. Note, sometimes you will get these strange artifacts on lights caused by the bias values, I believe, on your light. If you select a light and go to its settings here, you should be able to open up the shadow and play around with a bias value. And that should help. If you spend enough time tweaking it, it should help some of those artifacts. We'll have to spend some more time with this outside of this video. Let's go ahead back to our render settings and turn on soft shadows again, because I think soft shadows are more realistic and produce a more flattering picture. I'm going to go ahead and change my sunlight into the more common type of light that I use. I'll go back to my object data tab here and change my sun into an area light. I use area lights more than any other kind of light. I need to change the power up to something like 1500. And you know what? Under my render settings, I'm going to change my viewport up to something higher in terms of the number of samples, maybe 128, just to make samples or the shadows look a little bit more smooth. I don't think I need a cube size of quite that high for this demo. I'll turn it down a little bit. The next thing I want to talk about is, well, this little problem that my mouse cursor is currently pointing at. Let's go ahead and zoom in a little bit to show you what I mean. This little problem area, this little gap where an object is casting a shadow, but you will have a little noticeable gap there. If I go ahead and zoom out, and I'll go ahead and move my light over a little bit so I'm casting a more diagonal shadow. I'm going to select my cube. I'm noticing, by the way, that I'm having a hard time zooming in on my object. It's kind of slowing down as I'm scrolling my mouse wheel. If you have that problem ever, by the way, you can select an object that you're working on and then go up to the View menu and select Frame Selected. The keyboard shortcut is the period key on your number pad on your keyboard if you have an extended keyboard. If you press Frame Selected, it will zoom into that object, but it'll fix your scrolling so you can zoom closer in or farther out if you get stuck. You will see here that I have this little problem. My shadow is not meeting my cube corner, and that's noticeable, and that's the very first thing that initially bugged me when I started using the EEVEE render engine, and maybe you've been noticing it this entire time in this video. How do you fix this? Well, this problem requires a couple of very easy steps. First of all, this problem is being caused not by any of your scene settings or your render settings so much, but more by the settings of an individual light's shadow setting. So if I go and select the light that's casting that shadow, and I go down to its object data properties here, and I open up its shadow section, you can see there's a special section called contact shadows. As soon as I turn that little checkbox on, you can see if I zoom back in, the problem is essentially solved, but you have to be careful because this is sort of a little dangerous solution. If I turn that value or checkbox off, you can see that problem comes back. One of the things you can do to minimize this problem without using contact shadows, and I'll talk about why this is sort of an imperfect solution, is you can change this bias value. I think I might have adjusted it while I paused this video just a second ago. I believe this might have been a lower value, but what you want to do essentially is play with this value, and you will see that its default value, the bias, is, I believe, 1.00, and that makes this section quite noticeable. But if I turn this bias value down, you can see my little gap becomes smaller. So it goes down all the way to 1/1000th of a whole number. And once I've turned that down, then you can turn on contact shadows. But you will want to be mindful that you only want to go as far in terms of distance and thickness that you need to for your object. So if I hold shift on my keyboard and then drag with my mouse in this little area to the left, it'll turn that value all the way down, but in slower increments because I'm holding the shift key. And you can see that if I adjust this to a higher value, it's now going all the way out to about there. Did you see that? I'm going to go ahead and hold shift and turn that number down and up, and you can see where it's recalculating it and drawing it out to about there. I want to make this as small as I can. So I'm going to change it to something like, right about there or so. 0.06 is quite small. Now, another problem you might have is if you have quite a narrow object. I'm going to go ahead and tap S on my keyboard to scale this cube, but then I'll tap Shift Z on my keyboard to scale it not on the Z axis, so S and then Shift Z. Then I'll move my mouse to make this very narrow, and then I'll click. So let's go ahead and zoom in again. You can see that my contact shadow is doing kind of what it's supposed to. I'll go ahead to my light, I'll select it right there, and I'll zoom back in. The contact shadow is way too thick. It's too tall. It's casting a shadow that shouldn't be there. So I'll go back to this contact shadow section, and the distance is probably okay if I turn it off and then on. You know, it's probably even a little bit too far right now, so I'll go ahead and hold Shift and turn it down a little bit. Its thickness right here is too tall, so I'm going to hold Shift and turn that value down to something like that. Okay, that looks more realistic, maybe a little bit wider. And then I'll zoom back out, and you can see I've got a little contact shadow that is solving that problem. I can turn off, by the way, if things are getting in the way like this 3D cursor, I can turn off all my overlays and my gizmos on my screen with these two buttons so I can see my scene basically rendered. Now, in the comments below this video, I know I'm going to get some naysayers saying you should never use contact shadows. And here's why. Well, there's a couple of reasons why contact shadows can be a problem. Number one, contact shadows are a screen space effect. So that means that they can only exist when the object that's casting the shadow is on screen. And if you're animating your camera moving around, or animating that object coming from off screen onto the screen so you can see it through the camera's perspective, you will notice that you have problems with these little contact shadows because they will appear and disappear kind of at will. If you orbit over or pan over and put that object just out of view, you will notice that little contact shadow right there, it disappeared. And so if you're animating your camera and it's panning over and this object, this little pole, comes into view, well, you're going to notice that little problem where it just sort of appears in a very weird way on screen. And if the contact shadow is very small and it's very minimal and your audience is focusing on something else, they might not notice it, but that is one of the limitations of EEVEE and these contact shadows, okay? It's a screen space effect. And if you have especially long contact shadows because you didn't adjust that bias, well, you're going to notice it even more, and it's going to bug you a whole bunch. The other reason why contact shadows are not always ideal, or at least not ideal for specific use cases, is what's called light bleed. If you have, I'm going to go ahead and tap S on my keyboard, and I'll go ahead and tap Shift Z on my keyboard, so S, then Shift Z, and make this cube more cube-like, and I'll click. I'm going to go ahead and make this cube quite a lot bigger, actually, and I will, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and make this lamp a little bit higher. By the way, light objects used to be called lamps in old versions of Blender, so if I've ever said that in this video, if I've called it a lamp, you know why. I'm used to the lingo of old versions of Blender. I'm going to go ahead and make this cube into sort of a little room. So I'm going to go ahead in edit mode. I'll press tab to go into the edit mode of this cube. I'll select in edit mode faces, and I'll delete these two side faces. I'll press X on my keyboard and delete them. I'll go ahead and make a very quick window in the side of this room that we can see in. I'll go ahead and make a loop cut. Control R on my keyboard makes a loop cut. I'll click right there. I'll bevel it. Control B on my keyboard. I'll go ahead and make another loop cut. Control R and click, and Control B to bevel it into two edges. Now if I select this face and press X or delete on my keyboard, I can delete the face. Hey, I've got a window. Let's go ahead and press tab and look at the inside of our room. You can see there's a problem. I have some light bleed right there and there and there at the edges of my room. Light is coming through, and that does not look very good. Well, some people might solve this by simply going to that light. I'll select that light, go to the Object Data tab here, and turn up the distance of contact shadows, and well, hey, that fixed it. But it didn't, because as we know, contact shadows are a screen space effect, so you can see, depending on the angle, depending on if that object is in frame or not, or that part of that object is in frame or not in my camera, if I'm animating, it's not going to be a good solution. So I'm going to go and press Control Z, turn my contact shadow distance way back down. How do we solve this problem? Well, I'm going to go back into look dev mode or even solid mode so I can see my scene a little bit more clearly here, I'm going to select my room. The problem here is the thickness of my walls. Light is coming through in little corners because my walls are not even paper thin. To solve this, I'm going to select my room and go to the modifiers tab, where I'm going to, with the room selected, add a solidify modifier to this mesh, and the solidify modifier will give the walls some thickness. If I go ahead, my zoom has gotten stuck again. I'm going to press the period key on my numpad to reset that zoom, and you can see now it has some thickness, and I can change the thickness to make the wall maybe 0.1 meters. That means 10 centimeters thick, and so now my wall has some thickness. It's not very even. I can turn on even thickness here. That kind of fixed that little problem. There's off, there's on. And so now if I go back to rendered viewport shading, you can see I no longer have the light bleed problem that I had a moment ago. A few more settings under the render tab that you might want to change or enable are ambient occlusion and screen space reflections. Ambient occlusion will create shadows in little corners and crevices where naturally light would not bounce into a little crevice or corner in the corner of your room where maybe the floor meets the wall. It would get a little bit darker. You can see with ambient occlusion turned on, if I go ahead and zoom in, you can see some darkness in that shadow. If I turn that off, you can see that darkness goes away. You can adjust these settings to make it more realistic. I think the distance by default at 0.2 meters is often too low. I have to turn this value up to 0.5 or even 1 or even higher depending on the overall scale of my scene. If I zoom back out, you can see that looks a little bit better. You can change the factor here, which means how intense or how dark it gets in those crevices. So if I turn that down, maybe more subtle fading or shading in those areas is better. You can even click, if you drag in this area, you can turn the factor up to 1, or you can click in there and turn it up to a higher value, like 5, and that's very intense. Just to show you that you can do that, I'll change it to maybe 0.5. There you go. The last setting I'll talk about here in this camera tab in the render settings is screen space reflections. If you have any objects that are reflective, that means they have a material. I'll go ahead and select my room. I'll go to the material tab. You have this little tab when you have a mesh object selected. I'll get rid of all the material slots here, and I'll press new. I'm going to make the color of the room blue, and I'm going to make it not rough. And if you turn the roughness down on any material, it should be reflecting other things in the scene. I can see a very faint reflection of the window from here over here in this wall. If I go back to my render settings, that only happens because I turned this little checkbox on. It's called screen space reflections. You should know though that this effect is a screen space effect. That means that if the object being reflected is not on screen, it will not be reflected on things that are on the screen. So if I pan over a little bit and orbit, you will see that the window is no longer being reflected in this wall because we can't see it right now on our screen. That's the limitation of EEVEE again. So if it goes back on screen, now we can see that reflection again. Last up, let's go ahead and create a more sophisticated lighting setup that uses more than just one light in a nice and appropriate way. I'll go ahead and delete my room. I'll select it and press X on my keyboard and delete. Is this floor at a good level? No, it's not. So I'm going to go ahead and delete it with the X key on my keyboard. I'll press Shift A to bring up my add menu, and I'll add a mesh plane. I'll tap S with it selected, and then I'll tap 8 on my keyboard to make it bigger and press enter. I'll press Shift A. I'm going to add this time a mesh monkey. This is Suzanne. If you're not familiar with Suzanne, I'm going to go ahead and zoom in and press the little side view. I'll click on this little X gizmo here to go to my side right orthographic view, and I'm going to, with the monkey head selected, press Control 3 on my keyboard. Control 3 will add the subdivision surface modifier, which smooths out this monkey head, and I'll go ahead and right click and select Shade Smooth to make it look all nice and smooth. From my right view though, I'm going to tap R and rotate the monkey head so it's sitting flat, and then I'll move it up so it's on the ground. And now if I orbit around, you can see my monkey head is sitting nicely on the floor. The monkey head is backlit though, and what I want to do here is create a nice little setup of 3 lights called a 3-point light setup. This is commonly used in the television and movie industry as well as in 3D animation to light something in a more flattering way. I'm going to go ahead and press this little camera button to actually go through my camera's view right there. If I press it again, I can jump out of camera or into camera. I'll select my monkey head and make it face. I'll tap R and then Z, sort of just off the side of my camera, like the monkey's being interviewed or something like that. So let's light this like the monkey's being interviewed. I'm going to select my light. I'll actually jump out of my camera view now, and I'm going to go to my top view, the Z view, and I'm going to grab the light with the G key and move it over so it's lighting up one side of a monkey head, sort of from a 45-degree angle. Now I can see that my light is pointing in the wrong direction from this orange line, so I'll tap the R key on my keyboard to rotate it, and I'll click when it's pointing sort of at the monkey head. And if I orbit around, I can see it's kind of far away, and so I'll grab it and move it over, and it wasn't quite pointing properly at the monkey head. I think it's actually too high still, so I'll move it down, and I'll tap R and rotate it more, pointing at the monkey head. Are my levels good? If I select my light and go to my object data tab here, you can see my power is 1500. That might be a little bit bright. Maybe I'll change it back to 1000 or so and press enter. So that looks okay. If I go through my camera, you can see, I can see my monkey head in my scene. There's a few problems though. Number one is that this side, the opposite side of the monkey head, is probably too dark. It's a little bit stark. It's not very flattering. So often in a 3-point lighting setup, you have a key light, which is your primary first brightest light lighting up most of your subject's face. But then you have a fill light, and that fill light is not meant to cast shadows. It's meant to fill the shadows caused by the first light, your key light. So I'll press 7 to go back into my top view, or of course you can press the Z little button right there to go into your top orthographic view. And I will duplicate this key light. Shift D on your keyboard will duplicate, or of course you can right click and say duplicate objects right there. I've got a copy of my light. I grabbed it, I moved it over. I'll tap R on my keyboard to rotate it, and I'll put this key light over here pointing at the opposite side. Now, if you go back into your camera, you will see that it's very brightly lit, but not in a flattering way. You actually do want to have a key light from the top lighting part of your character's or your subject's face, but then you also do want a little bit of shadow. So your key light will be brightest. Your fill light should be less intense just to fill those shadows. So I'm going to select the fill light, turn the power way down, something to like 300 watts. Let's go ahead and turn it down even more. Let's say 100 watts. And if I want to see what my scene looks like without that key light, I can simply go up to my outliner here. I've got my key light, which is area, and my fill light, area.001. I can simply turn it off and on to see what its effect does with this little eyeball, which hides it in my scene. If I want to turn that light off in my render, I can turn off this little camera tab. If you don't have this little camera, not tab, button, you can go up to filter and enable that little camera button right there. I'm not sure if it's on by default. You might just have the row of eyeballs there by default. So is that doing what I want it to do? I think so. You might find that if you have lights that are too small, I'll go ahead and break out of my camera. If this fill light is quite small, and if it's too bright, I'll go ahead and turn its brightness up to, well, let's say 1000 again. You're going to find that shadows go in multiple directions. And I call this kind of the ice capades effect, where if you're ever watching figure skating, you'll notice that because spotlights, many spotlights, often 3 or 4, are pointing at the skater on the white ice, that there will be shadows coming off, very harsh, unflattering shadows are coming off in several directions on the ice. You don't want that if you're making a movie or an animation. So you want to have a bigger light here, which will have a more diffuse or soft shadow, and you want to turn this power way down. I'm going to say 150 watts or so. Now, if you have a subject, let's say you have a person that you're filming and they have dark hair. Well, their dark hair might blend in with the night sky of your background. If you have the same color anywhere on your subject that you have in your background, your subject will not be very well defined. Your viewers won't be able to tell where your subject ends and the background starts. They won't be able to tell the shape of your subject very well, which is why you need a third light called a backlight or a rim light, which creates separation between your subject and their background. So I'm going to go back up to my top view. I'm going to select my fill light and I'm going to duplicate it. This time I'll right click and say duplicate objects, and then I'll tap G, or it actually gets grabbed automatically. I'll move it behind my monkey head. I'll tap R to point it in the right direction. And if I orbit around, what I'm going to do here is probably end up pointing it a little bit more straight down. So I'm lighting up the top of the head. So from the camera's view, it's a little bit brighter here, which if the background, my floor in this case, and the monkey head are the same color, then this part of the floor will be darker than the top of the monkey head. So it'll create kind of like a little halo effect. Let's go ahead very quickly and select the floor. I'll go to my materials tab, add a new material. I'm going to make both the monkey head and the floor a kind of dark maroon color. So I'll make dark red and I'll turn roughness down. You can see, by the way, I see the reflections of lights in my scene. That's okay. I'm actually going to change the color here to like a dark emerald color. I kind of like the idea of that. So let's make it quite a lot darker here. And I like the look of that. So I'll select my monkey head and I'm not going to add a new material. I'll instead click right next to it and select the same emerald green color. Now, if I go back to my camera, you can see that if I select this backlight or rim light and turn it off, there is less lighting on the top of the monkey head and less separation. Let's go and see what happens if I turn the power of that up. I'm going to try 500. You can see what happens. I am illuminating some of the floor around the monkey, but more I'm lighting up the rim of, or the top of the monkey's head, creating separation. That's off, that's on. So that makes it much more visible and easy to see where the monkey head stops and the background starts. Be careful though, because I can see the reflection of that rim light or backlight right here on my floor. I'll turn it off and on. This does not look good. So what I'll do is I'll select that lamp. I'll break out of my camera view. I'm going to actually split this view into two. So I'm going to put my mouse up in the top corner of this viewport here, and when I put my mouse in the corner, it turns into a little plus. And if you know Blender's interface and how to customize it, you'll know that if you have that little plus and you click and drag down, in my case, you can split the window into two. So in this viewport, I can look through my camera and I'll go back into render viewport shading. And in this viewport, I can adjust where the light is. So I'll go ahead and I'll try adjusting it so it's not in frame. It looks like if I move it back and angle it, it gets even worse. So I'm going to move it forward and maybe up. Yeah, up seems to be my key there. And I will rotate it and point it back down. And because it's farther away, it's not illuminating the monkey head so much. So I'm going to have to turn that value up to maybe something like 1,000 or so. So I get more illumination on the top of the monkey head there. I am getting some reflection down here, so I will actually move that forward a little bit and I'll angle it more down, and I'm going to turn this way up to maybe 2,000 or so. You know what? I'm going to pause the video and I'll come back when I found a good solution to this. And I'm back, and I found a fairly unconventional solution for this problem. You can see I've got a fairly nice rim light now, and I've accomplished this not by using my favorite, an area light, but instead by making my backlight, my rim light, a spotlight instead. So this seems to work pretty well. I'm not illuminating anything because I've got it at such an angle facing sort of against or away from the floor towards the back of the monkey head. I'm creating this nice little separation rim light here. Maybe I can turn the power down, maybe to something like 500 if I don't want it quite so intense, or even less than that depending on what I want. But there is one little problem now, and that is this reflection on the floor and the fact that I am lighting up some of the floor around in front of my monkey head just a little bit. What I can do here is select the spotlight, and if I go to its properties here under the object data tab, of course, and I open up this custom distance section and enable it, well, you can see that I can have the light only last so far. I can cut the light off from illuminating anything past a certain point with this custom distance, which by default is set to 40 meters. But if I change this value way down, in fact, I'm going to type in a value that I know works, 7.9 meters, and I'll press enter. When I do that, the light only goes to right, well, if I zoom in, right there. It stops there. So it's illuminating the monkey's head, but because that distance is too short to illuminate the floor in front of the monkey head, I am lighting up the monkey head and not the floor or anything else. So I seem to think that that works pretty well. If I turn off that light, which by the way is still called area.002, if I turn it off and on, you can see up there, it's creating a nice little bit of separation. Last but not least, in this video, I'm going to actually render out this picture to an image file and save it onto my computer. Before I do that though, I'm going to select my monkey head and I'm going to create more separation. I'm going to change its color. So with the monkey head selected, I'll go down to the materials tab. You can see that with this number 2, I have two uses or two objects, my floor and the monkey head, that are using the same material. So I'm going to press that number 2 to make it go away, to make an instance or a different copy of the same material, and I'll change it to a different color. I'll make it, let's say a brighter red or something like that. And you know what? I'm going to change my ground color to maybe a brighter green, just so we have a little bit of a brighter scene. Something, like that, sure. And I'm going to move my ground a little bit because I can see past my ground here at the top corners of my camera view. So I'm going to select my ground and tap G on my keyboard, and then I'll tap Shift Z on my keyboard, G, then Shift Z will let me move it, but not on the Z axis, so it won't move up and down. Then I'll just move the ground a little bit back so we can't see. In fact, you know what I'll do? I'll just tap S on my keyboard and make the ground a little bit bigger. Let's go ahead and render image, and that will create an image inside of Blender in a new window. Because I've turned my settings up a little bit under my render tab, the render took 6.73 seconds. Not too bad on this computer. To save this picture, I'm going to go up to the image menu and then select Save As. It's not rocket science here. When I click Save As, I get a save dialog box. I can save onto my desktop here under System Shortcuts. On my desktop, I'm going to name this picture monkey head. And I'm going to leave that .png at the end of the image. A PNG is a compressed, although it's a lossless compressed image file format. That means that it is a smaller file size than something like a huge raw image file or a BMP bitmap old file type, but it does not lose quality. You don't get the artifacts that you would get if you switched over on this right side panel from a PNG to something like a JPEG. A JPEG is very common, but you lose some quality. JPEGs can be much smaller in file size, so if you're limited in storage size, you might choose JPEG, but I'll go ahead and select PNG. I'll leave it as monkeyhead.png on my desktop. I'll save as an image file. And so now if I close this window and I minimize Blender on my desktop here, I've got that monkeyhead.png picture file. If I double click on it, it'll open up in whatever my default picture viewer is on my computer. And you can see I've got my final render, and it looks pretty good for what it is. That will be it for this video though. Again, my name is Colin. Thank you so much for watching this video. Again, if you like this video or if you learned something in it, please go ahead and click on that like button below this video. It really helps out me and my channel and gets these videos more seen. If you want to see more videos like this one in either Blender or in the Godot game engine, go ahead and click on subscribe and the bell icon below. You know what to do. Check out my Facebook page and my Instagram page. In those two places, I post sneak peeks and previews of what I'm working on next, and that's where I communicate with all of you the most, except here on YouTube on my channel. That'll be it for this one though. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.